heard of an elderly woman who was in a nursing home, and a pastor visited her and said, do you have any anxieties or worries? And she says, my my worry is, I'm so old now. All my friends are 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 gone, and I know they're up in heaven, and my worry is that they're wondering which way I went. You know, like, where is she? She must have gone to the other place. Anyway, of course, we can always have different worries, anxieties, things, fears about things, and of course, that's Jesus in our gospel today. Come to me, all you who labor and are burdened, and I will give you rest. Give us that rest that we need for our hearts, our souls, our lives, and it's great to as we gather here to support one another in our lives, in our faith. Um, and in our gospel today, Jesus, speaks about, we hear about, the wisdom of God, the wisdom of the world, and it's interesting how I was heard. There's a guy, person who was speaking about someone who lives in the world of academia. He's a college professor, and he spoke about uh, that people who have a lot of knowledge. And he made this statement: academics, scholars, university professors are like any other segment of society. They're a complex mix. In university circles, you find some of the most humble, gracious, faith-filled, and genuinely good people you will ever meet. Just as you will also find some of the most arrogant, self-absorbed, amoral, and cynical people in the world. The academic world looks just like the rest of the world. In other words, making the comment that um, just because we might have a lot of knowledge doesn't mean we, that sometimes knowledge can, if it separates you from others, if it divides, if it causes you to simply uh, not live in union, and that's actually the meaning of salvation, living in union with God, the world, and with others, living out of that union as opposed to the separateness of them, us, them, that divided world that we see. Jesus challenging the religious leaders of his time. They didn't see the other as their neighbor, as the one. And so when you can have knowledge, but then it creates separation and division, rather than the wisdom of God. And wisdom means the wholeness, seeing and recognizing the wholeness that's within. It was mentioned that during the Second World War, the most educated country in the world, had the most PhDs and most academic degrees, was Germany. They had the bookstore in every corner, the most well-read, well-educated, and yet, that was the place from which the Holocaust came. You use knowledge to create the us, them, the division. And so it's not always what, it's the wisdom of God, of the heart, of that love. And as Jesus speaks about, the mind of a child, lest you become like a child. In other words, a child recognizes the relationship, lives out of a relationship. And it's like, how are we called to live out of relationship as a child recognizes that, and to have that same understanding and have same regard. That so often we can, when we approach life, we can be like a landscaper. In other words, sometimes that's how we can impose like a grid on the world in which we live. Like, you're landscaping a place, you say grass is good, weeds are bad, right? You separate things out. Uh, birds are good, groundhogs not so good if you have a garden, right? And sometimes if you try to apply that, if you go out into the forest, you go into a forest and you might say, everything seems chaotic, right? You just want to go in with a lawnmower and a weed whacker, right, and clear everything out. But to see that within the forest is a harmony. Everything fits together. Everything belongs. And if you take something out, it destroys the whole. They say, like, well, we don't like wolves, so we take them out, and of course it affects the whole way everything fits together. There's a intelligibility there. There's a oneness, a wholeness that we often can't see if we try to simply impose that impose an order instead of recognizing what's already there. In fact, the word cosmos means the order of things, intelligibility. And how do we, live out of connectedness, live out of union? I was reading about, like last year when I was taking a trip up to the Canadian Rockies, and was learning about the forests, the beautiful forests up there. But many of them have become overgrown and are diseased, and a lot of it is because of, say, of fire suppression. They said instead of, fire was seen as bad, like when the settlers came over, and the native peoples would have regular fires in order to replenish the forest. And in fact, many of the pine cones up there, they only open when you get a heat that's as hot enough as a forest fire produces. So it's already incorporated into the natural world, but when you try to deny something or push it aside, it kind of affects the whole. And so what's happened is they've created this kind of, so when you come up with a presupposition, this doesn't fit into the order in which I put in, but instead of finding the intelligibility, finding that wisdom of the whole and seeing how it connects. And that's why we had that the beautiful reading from Ecclesiastes when it speaks about, it's a time for everything, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to plant and a time to uproot the plant, and how both are about the wholeness, embracing both sides of the journey, both parts of life and death and resurrection, the paschal mystery. And the more we connect to that, the more we embrace and see that it is all good. It all fits into God's plans. It's all a part of this wonderful way of having that childlike mind. It doesn't separate and divide, but sees, recognizes, lives out of the wholeness. And that's spirituality. It said the rational mind separates, divides, creates an object, a subject-object split. But the spiritual mind is able to then go beyond that to see the wholeness, live out of and participate in and with. And I think that's when Jesus is speaking of, that mind of a child that lives out of that union, lives out of that connectedness, and sees that greater good, that greater whole. It's like the story about there's a person who had this huge farm, and he has a horse that he used for plowing, and the horse ran off, and the guy went to the holy man and says, it's the worst possible thing, my horse has run off, it's bad. And the wise man said, maybe. And then the next day the horse came back with 5 other horses. And the guy says, oh, this is good. And the man says, well, maybe. And then his son was training these horses and then for plowing, and then a son fell and broke his leg, and the fellow went to the wise man again and says, oh, this is terrible. And he says, maybe. And it turns out the next day this army came through and took off all the able-bodied men into war. And he says, oh, I'm so grateful that my son had broken his leg. And so sometimes how things fit into the tapestry, into the wholeness. And so sometimes we too quickly move to a position to judge something as opposed to seeing how everything gets used, how God incorporates everything into a greater good, which is what allows Good Friday to become good, as God is able to take the difficulties, the challenges, and transform and heal them and bring about that newness. And so, as our Lord speaks of in the gospel today. And so in the way in which, birth and growth, health is embraced alongside with loss or failure, sickness, old age, they're able to become part of a wholeness in life. The timeless that God is placed in our hearts. So, that there's a goodness and a wholeness. And so a wonderful way in which our Lord helps us to, live out of that same trust. And that's what causes that stress and that worry. Do not let your hearts be anxious and worried and upset. You know, and that's because basically we're trying to do God's job. And instead of, trusting in the Lord, doing what we can, we try to say, well, I have to do all of this. It's just like when at the feeding of the 5,000, you know, and Jesus says, let's feed them. And they said, well, we can't possibly feed them. Let's just send them away. And Jesus basically just, one child stepped forward with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he says that's all he needed. And out of that, he was able to feed the 5,000. He says, just contribute what you can and let God take care of the rest. Don't worry about, but this is too much of a burden, and taking upon myself all of this. He just says, do your best, let God do the rest. Let God trust in him to be able to allow something good to come out of this situation. And don't try to take upon yourself having to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps in order to make that possible. And of course, that brings us to the other part of our gospel today. He says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. So I want to thank Dean Anderson for donating his yoke for today. And of course, we look at it, this is yoke. And like any yoke, it's Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. And as we see with a yoke, he's giving us a yoke, but there's a place for two. In other words, take your yoke upon you, and because I'm on the other side of the yoke. So he's giving us, not only is a burden to pull, but he's giving us himself to help carry and pull that burden. And when you add another to the yoke, it's not like 1 + 1. It multiplies. It's actually, if 2 oxen can pull 4 times as much as just one. So the Lord is helping to remind us of this image of he's joining himself to us, helping us to embrace whatever challenges and difficulties in our life. So this wonderful image that he provides to us today. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. And with that, as we gather here today as God's family, may we truly trust in the Lord's goodness as we receive him and allow him to help us on our life journey, and in so doing, being able to help and assist each of our brothers and sisters in the same way.